Lost doesn't always mean vanished. Sometimes it means a film slipped out of the mainstream conversation because the decade around it was too crowded, too strange, or too distracted to hold on to it. The 1970s gave horror more than its famous classics. It also gave drive-in occult thrillers, grimy eco-revenge, haunted houses that turned domesticity predatory, vampire reinventions that refused to glamorize the bite, psychological nightmares that barely look like horror at first glance, and surreal oddities too weird to fit any shelf. On a hillside outside San Antonio, two men with binoculars watched a bonfire and a circle of robed figures gather around a body. The footage holds for nearly a minute before the ritual turns ceremonial, the chanting deliberate, the staging unmistakable. By the time the camera cuts back to their faces, the audience already knows the vacation is over. Race with the Devil spends its first reel building a recreational vehicle road trip between two motorcycle dealers, their wives, and a small dog, then collapses that road trip into a chase across rural Texas in which every law enforcement officer, gas station attendant, and friendly local turns out to be in on it. The film is remembered, when it is remembered, as one of the cleanest gateways into 1970s horror that didn't sit comfortably inside any one genre. Director Jack Starrett, a veteran of biker pictures and television cop dramas, treats the cult less as a supernatural threat than as a logistical problem the family cannot solve. The recreational vehicle is fortress and target at once. Peter Fonda and Warren Oates play the men as competent, prepared, and steadily wrong about every safe house they choose, while Loretta Swit and Lara Parker hold the interior tension as the trip stops being a trip. The picture cost roughly $1.5 million to make and brought back more than 10 times that figure at the drive-in, which is the economic story of a lot of overlooked horror from the decade. A modest budget, an aggressive concept, and a distributor willing to play it through the summer. What gives the picture its lingering pull is the ending, which does not resolve so much as widen. The conspiracy turns out to be larger than the highway, larger than the county, possibly larger than anything the family has the means to escape. Whether they ever did is a question the film leaves open by design. In the winter of 1973, in a converted residence in Tehuacana, Texas, director S.F. Brownrigg shot Don't Look in the Basement in under 2 weeks on a budget of roughly $100,000. The location was a former rest home, the cast a mix of local theater actors and regional film regulars. The script a single setup carried by performance and atmosphere rather than spectacle. The plot is contained to a single building. A young nurse, hired to assist at an unconventional psychiatric institution, arrives shortly after a violent incident has left the senior doctor dead. The residents remain. The treatment philosophy was acting out, the idea that letting the patients perform their delusions would diffuse them. And with the supervising authority gone, the philosophy continues without supervision. The nurse spends the rest of the film realizing that no one in the building is reliable, that the chain of command is decorative, and that the categories of staff and resident are no longer fixed. The grimy 16mm texture, the close interior framing, and the regional accents give the picture a documentary unease that more polished productions could not have produced. The marketing did the rest. Distributor Hallmark Releasing paired the film with The Last House on the Left in 1973, and the double bill played the drive-in circuit for years. The picture eventually earned enough to put Brownrigg's small operation on the map, and the title outlived the studio that sold it. Brownrigg would direct 3 more regional horror features before the decade ended, although none matched the first picture's commercial reach. The Texas independent horror tradition he came out of fed into a regional cycle, running parallel to the better-known American horror of the late 1970s. The road into Astaroth runs through forest that doesn't lie still. Branches shift, the bus driver hums a tune that isn't on any radio, and the conductor will not answer questions about where the town actually is. By the time the young heroine of Lamora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural, arrives at the place she has been summoned, the film has already announced its rules. This is not a horror picture organized around shocks or kills. It is one organized around the slow corruption of a fairy tale. The story sends Lila Lee, a 13-year-old church singer, into the countryside in search of her dying gangster father, who has asked her to visit before the end. What she finds instead is a woman called Lamora, a household of children who do not quite seem to be children, and a strain of vampirism mixed up with witchcraft, coming of age, and the kind of religious imagery the film both invokes and inverts. Director Richard Blackburn, working from a script he co-wrote with Robert Fern, treats the whole thing as a storybook seen through fever, with Cheryl Smith's performance holding the center as the audience's last point of orientation. The Catholic Film Newsletter condemned the picture on release. Its early reputation as exploitation kept it from a wider audience, even as the film itself worked harder to be poetry than provocation. Where the picture's power finally lands is in the question of who Lila has become by the closing scene. The film offers an answer in image rather than statement, and viewers continue to disagree about what they have actually watched. That ambiguity is the picture's signature and the reason it has outlived its initial reception. Blackburn never directed another feature. He later worked as a screenwriter on Albert Brooks's Lost in America, which is the closing detail few viewers expect to find attached to the same filmmaker. The setup sounds like a press release Dean Stockwell would never have written, but here it is. The press secretary to the President of the United States is a werewolf. Not turning into one, not suspected of being one, openly and on the record one, attacking citizens in the dead of night, and returning to brief the press corps in daylight. The Werewolf of Washington is the kind of premise the early 1970s could land without flinching, because the actual news of the period had already broken whatever fence existed between political reality and political nightmare. I'll grant you the picture isn't scary in any traditional sense, and director Milton Moses Ginsburg isn't trying for that. He's trying for satire with monster makeup attached. Stockwell plays Jack Whittier with a stiff-collared sincerity that makes the eventual transformations funnier than they should be, and the film leans into set pieces that read as protest theater rather than horror beats. There's a sequence in a bowling alley. There's a scene in which the wolf attacks a small-statured scientist working on something classified in a White House sub-basement. There's a bit involving a finger that catches on a door handle, which is the sort of thing the film delivers with a perfectly straight face. What sticks isn't the comedy, it's the dating. Ginsburg shot during the actual Watergate window, and the picture's release is shadowed by the impeachment proceedings that overtook it. The film is now read as a time capsule of paranoia rendered as low-budget horror, and the print sat in obscurity long enough that its rediscovery has been treated by some critics as the recovery of a minor period document. Ginsburg never directed another feature. For 4 decades, the British entry to the 1974 Cannes Film Festival was a film the British Film Institute could not find. Selected, screened, reviewed, and entered into the historical record as a representative work of the country's psychological horror tradition, Symptoms then disappeared. Prints went into storage, rights tangled, the director moved on, and by the late 1970s, the picture had become one of those titles cited in genre histories with a note that no clean copy was known to survive. Its reputation was preserved by people who had seen it once. The film was directed by José Ramón Larraz, a Spanish filmmaker working in the United Kingdom on a run of features that mixed eroticism, isolation, and quiet menace inside English country houses. Symptoms is the least sensational of those pictures and arguably the strongest. Angela Pleasance, daughter of Donald, plays a young woman named Helen who invites a friend to stay at the family home, a dilapidated property surrounded by woods and water. The neighbor, a man called Brady, watches the house from a distance. Something happened there before. Helen knows what, although she does not say. The film moves slowly, deliberately, and stays close to her face as she begins to lose track of the boundary between what the house is doing to her and what she is doing inside it. There is barely any music. Most of the soundtrack is wind, dripping water, and the small mechanical noises of an old building. The rediscovery came in 2014, when the BFI National Archive located a usable print and announced a full restoration. The screening at the BFI South Bank that year was treated as an event, with critics writing about the picture as if it had been waiting for them to be ready. Restored, the film looked better than its 1970s reception had suggested, and the consensus shifted. This was not a curiosity from a busy filmmaker. It was a serious work that had been kept out of circulation by accident and indifference. The restoration was followed by a home video release, a wider critical reappraisal, and a generation of younger audiences encountering the picture as if it had been made for them. Larraz, who died in 2013 before the restoration's release, did not live to see the recovery of the picture his admirers had long argued was the finest he made. The dream begins with water and a child's voice that the dreamer does not recognize and yet trusts. Sherry Bennett wakes from it sitting upright with the bedside lamp on, and the impression that something is wrong with a girl she has raised since infancy but has no legal claim to. The premonition belongs to the small subgenre of 1970s horror that treats motherhood itself as the supernatural channel, with maternal love rendered as a psychic instrument that activates when the family is threatened from outside. The threat in this case is the biological mother, who has emerged from institutional care unstable and intent on retrieving her daughter, accompanied by a partner whose grasp on reality is no firmer. Director Robert Allen Schnitzer keeps the legal mechanics of the custody question in the background and treats the emotional mechanics as the horror engine. Sherry's visions are not always literal, sometimes arriving as fragmented sensory impressions rather than narrative previews, and the film spends as much time inside her psychological compression as it does on the more conventional thriller, plotting around the kidnapping. The Mississippi locations help. The picture was shot largely in and around Jackson, with the heat and the river acting as a constant pressure on the frame. The film was distributed by Avco Embassy and earned modestly enough to keep Schnitzer working in features for a few more years, but its critical reputation has grown since. Writers on the picture have noted that it sits closer to art horror than its drive-in marketing implied, and that the question of whether Sherry's gift is real, residual, or symptomatic is left open in a way the genre rarely allowed at the time. The film does not tell its audience how to read its mother. "We just wanted to do a monster movie," Dennis Muren told an interviewer years later about the picture that made his reputation. Although the fuller truth is that he and his friends ended up making something the field would still be drawing from 40 years on. Equinox began in 1967 as a student film shot on weekends in the hills above Los Angeles by a group of young filmmakers who would later staff the visual effects departments of the next generation's biggest pictures. The original version ran short, was acquired by producer Jack H. Harris, and was substantially recut, expanded, and released theatrically in 1970 with new framing scenes and a polished score. The plot is the bones of every demonic cabin movie that would come after it. 4 young people drive into the woods to visit a professor, find his cabin destroyed, recover a Latin grimoire, and trigger a series of confrontations with stop-motion creatures pulled out of a tradition the makers had grown up watching at matinees. The film is hand-built in the most literal sense. Costumes were sewn at home. Creatures were puppeted from kitchen tables. The compositing of live actors with miniature monsters was done with rear projection and matte paintings that would have embarrassed a more cautious crew. And that obvious roughness is part of the picture's lasting appeal. What the film did, almost by accident, was hand a template to the next 2 decades of low-budget American horror, with Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead drawing on it openly and a generation of independent filmmakers learning that the genre rewarded invention over polish. The sound of the worms arrives before they do. A wet, rasping crawl, hundreds of thousands of bodies moving across Earth that the downed power lines have electrified through the topsoil, pouring out of every patch of damp ground in a small Georgia town until the streets, the houses, and the throats of unlucky locals are alive with them. Squirm is the eco-horror picture you remember not for any single set piece, but for the cumulative texture of the thing, the way the camera keeps lowering itself to the ground until even ground itself has become hostile. Look, I have to be honest about my relationship to this movie. I love it. I love that director Jeff Lieberman committed completely to a premise that the trailer can only sort of explain with a straight face. I love that Rick Baker, before he was a multiple Oscar winner, was the young effects artist hired to build the practical work, and that his work involves actual worms in the millions sourced from bait farms and dumped onto actors with their consent and presumably hazard pay. The premise is silly on paper. The execution is genuinely tactile in a way digital effects have never managed to reproduce, and the film is one of the cleanest demonstrations of why 1970s creature features still play better than the slicker imitators that came after. The other thing worth mentioning is that the picture was filmed almost entirely in Port Wentworth, Georgia, a town of fewer than 4,000 people at the time, and the production reportedly purchased every worm the regional bait industry could supply for the duration of the shoot. Lieberman would direct Blue Sunshine the following year, another genre experiment that ran on similar low-budget invention and earned him a small but durable cult reputation outside the studio system. After Rosemary's Baby, American studios spent several years looking for the next occult property that could perform like a prestige picture, and The Mephisto Waltz is the cleanest example of that hunt, producing a film that is interesting rather than imitative. Released by 20th Century Fox in 1971, directed by Paul Wenkos from Fred Mustard Stewart's novel, the picture stars Alan Alda as a music journalist named Miles Clarkson and Kurt Jurgens as Duncan Ely, the dying concert pianist whose home Miles is invited into. The mechanism of the plot is a soul transfer. Ely, a Satanist with the resources and the network to arrange the ritual, transfers his consciousness into Miles's body at the moment of his own death, leaving Miles's wife Paula, played by Jacqueline Bisset, to slowly understand that the man returning to her bed is not the man who left. The film is careful with its agency questions. Miles is the unwitting host of the ritual, not a knowing participant, and Paula's eventual decision to take her own occult action is presented as the response of someone trapped by circumstance rather than corrupted by ambition. The score, by Jerry Goldsmith, is one of the period's under-discussed pieces of horror composition, with the title Waltz reappearing in distorted forms across the picture as Paula's understanding of her situation deepens. Wenkos worked largely in television before and after the picture, and the film's reputation suffered briefly from that association. Time has been kinder. The film has been reclaimed in recent decades as one of the more elegant entries in the post-Rosemary's Baby occult cycle, sleeker than its drive-in competitors and more morally serious than its premise initially suggested. Goldsmith composed the score the same year he was working on Patton, a juxtaposition that explains why a horror picture about ritual identity theft sounds the way it does. In the autumn of 1972, a Gothic mansion in West Sussex stood empty long enough that an arriving film unit could use the building's actual rooms as both location and set. The production was The Legend of Hell House, directed by John Hoof and adapted by Richard Matheson from his own 1971 novel, with a brief from producer James H. Nicholson to make a haunted house film that took itself seriously enough to feel different from the Hammer competition. The setup is procedural. An eccentric millionaire hires a physicist, a mental medium, a physical medium, and the physicist's wife to spend a week inside a house known to have killed previous investigators, with a substantial payment promised to whoever can confirm or refute survival after death. The cast splits the work cleanly. Roddy McDowall plays the only investigator who has been inside the building before, having survived the previous attempt at great personal cost, and the film treats his refusal to engage as the most rational response in the group. Pamela Franklin, as the mental medium, takes on the psychic load. Clive Reville, as the physicist, brings a device he believes will solve the haunting through electromagnetic intervention. The house meets each of them on terms that match their vulnerabilities, which is the film's central insight about what a haunting actually does. Huff holds the picture in the long English country shadows that the source novel had described and stages most of the confrontations as endurance tests rather than set pieces. The picture was released in the summer of 1973 to mixed reviews and steady business, and its reputation has compounded since. The film is now widely regarded as one of the strongest haunted house pictures of the decade, a position that took years for the critical conversation to settle on, but that few writers on the subgenre would now dispute. The pond seethes. Bullfrogs the size of small dogs squat on cypress roots while water snakes braid through duckweed and lizards work the edges of the patio stones. Before any dialogue is spoken in Frogs, the picture has already committed to its central claim. The swamp has had enough. The setting is a private island in the Florida wetlands where the Crockett family is gathered to celebrate the patriarch's birthday. Jason Crockett, played by Ray Milland from a wheelchair he uses as a throne, has spent his life dominating the property and the animals on it. The film positions a young nature photographer, played by Sam Elliott, in one of his first leading roles, as the outsider who notices the trouble first. The frogs are coordinating. Then the snakes, the spiders, the lizards, and the leeches join them. Director George McCowan stages the killings as a series of escalating misadventures, with each family member meeting an end matched to whatever attitude toward nature the screenplay had previously assigned them. The class allegory is not subtle, and the film is not trying to be subtle. The drive-in audience of 1972 had not paid for subtle. The picture grossed roughly $10 million on a budget under $1 million, a return that put it among the more profitable American international releases of its year. The critics were unmoved. The box office was not, and a generation of filmmakers took note that animals' revenge horror had room to grow. The film became a perennial late-night television entry through the 1980s, where its title and poster did more selling than the contents required. On the gray afternoons of a wet English Christmas, Auntie Roo throws an annual orphans party at her country house, dressing the front rooms in tinsel and the rear rooms in something the children are not invited to see. Whoever Slew Auntie Roo is the second of director Curtis Harrington's two collaborations with Shelley Winters following 1971's What's the Matter with Helen? And the film operates inside the same vein of psychological horror that Robert Aldrich opened with Whatever Happened to Baby Jane a decade earlier. The story is a fairy tale retelling that the picture does not bother to disguise. Auntie Roo, the widow of a wealthy man, has kept her dead daughter mummified upstairs in a crib and conducts grieving seances with the help of a fraudulent medium who steals from her between sittings. When two orphans from the local home arrive for the holiday party, Auntie Roo decides the younger one resembles her own daughter enough to keep. The older brother, having read the Brothers Grimm, recognizes the situation immediately. The film treats his recognition as both protective and reductive, since the woman he is escaping is a grieving mother as much as she is the witch in the tale he has placed her inside. Harrington draws performances from Winters that lean toward the operatic without quite tipping over, and the chilly British supporting cast keeps the picture grounded. American International released the film with the alternate title Gingerbread House in some territories. Winters cited it among the more challenging roles she took during the period. The picture is generally classed with the post-Baby Jane wave of psychological horror built around veteran female stars, a subgenre critics have since labeled hagsploitation, although the productions themselves rarely embrace the term. I went to sea once, in a small boat. That is Molly, telling her nephews a bedtime story about her father, although the story she tells them is not the story we will gradually be told about him. The Witch Who Came from the Sea is one of those 1970s horror films that barely registers as horror on the first reel because its language for what is happening inside its protagonist is not the language the genre had trained audiences to expect. Molly, played by Millie Perkins in the performance most reviewers consider her career best, lives in a small California coastal town, works in a bar, and helps her sister raise her two nephews. She drinks too much, drifts in and out of relationships, and watches television in which men she briefly recognizes turn into versions of her father. The film tracks her as a series of incidents in town become harder to separate from her interior life, with the violent imagery the picture stages presented partly as memory, partly as compulsion, and partly as something Molly herself cannot place. The damage at the root of all of it is implied rather than narrated, and director Matt Cimber lets the picture circle the source without ever quite pointing at it. The cinematography, by Dean Cundey before his career took its later turn, finds a sun-bleached quality on the California waterfront that makes the film feel more displaced than gothic. Cundey would shoot Halloween for John Carpenter 2 years later, and the visual restraint he developed here reads, in retrospect, as preparation for the slow-burn horror style he soon helped define. The picture was banned in the United Kingdom during the 1980s video nasties crackdown, a categorization that did more to obscure it than to describe it. Modern critics have argued the film should be read alongside Robert Altman's Images and Roman Polanski's Repulsion as a study of unraveling perception, with the horror genre acting as the only available frame for what its protagonist cannot otherwise say. The film refuses a clean resolution. By the closing scene, the audience has been shown enough to understand Molly's situation, but the picture declines to grant either her or the viewer the satisfaction of a confession or an arrest. Whatever continues happens off-screen, and what does happen on screen is left to settle without comment. A professor of philosophy named Peter Proud begins having a recurring dream in which he is a different man, in a different decade, being murdered by his wife in a lake. He wakes in his own bed and reports the dream to his doctor, who classifies it as stress. The dreams continue. The lake in the dream has a real shape with a real shoreline. The reincarnation of Peter Proud is the supernatural mystery the mid-1970s was uniquely positioned to produce, treating its premise with the procedural seriousness usually reserved for police investigations. Director J. Lee Thompson, a veteran of the Guns of Navarone and Cape Fear, brings a thriller's discipline to material that in other hands would have leaned camp. Michael Sarrazin plays Proud as a man whose intellectual confidence collapses in proportion to how much of his dream he can match to real geography in western Massachusetts. The film hands him the tools of an academic, with maps, archives, and local interviews, and watches him assemble a case for a previous life that the people around him are not equipped to refute on its own terms. Jennifer O'Neill, playing the daughter of the woman Proud's previous self was married to, becomes the moral fault line. Margot Kidder, as the woman Proud is trying to identify, treats the encounter with him as if a long-closed door has reopened. The picture's final act has been debated since its release. The film commits to its premise without insisting on it, and the question of whether Proud's reincarnation is literal, psychiatric, or something the film itself does not entirely answer remains open by design. The screenplay was adapted by Max Ehrlich from his own novel, and Ehrlich would continue to develop similar material across the rest of the decade, although none of the follow-ups reached the same audience. After The Exorcist opened in December 1973 and posted the highest grosses of the year, every studio with international distribution looked for a film to ride the same wave. Beyond the Door, an Italian-American co-production directed by Ovidio G. Asinitis, was one of the earliest and one of the strangest answers. Released in Italy in 1974 and in the United States in 1975, the picture sold itself on the possession premise while quietly going somewhere stranger than its model. Juliette Mills, the British actress better known for Nanny and the Professor, plays a San Francisco woman who is pregnant with a child she cannot fully account for, and who begins to behave in ways the film stages with full operatic commitment. The picture is not subtle. There are levitations, head turnings, projectile incidents, and a recurring confrontation with a former lover who appears to know more about her condition than he is willing to explain. Asinitis keeps the camera moving and the score loud, and the film registers as one of the more sensational entries in the brief Italian-American possession cycle that ran through the middle of the decade. Where The Exorcist worked through dread, this picture works through escalation, with the imagery accumulating until the closing reel has nowhere left to escalate to. Warner Brothers sued. The studio claimed Beyond the Door infringed on The Exorcist in a manner that crossed from genre overlap into property, and the case ended in a settlement. The picture, by then, had already earned roughly $15 million in the United States alone, more than enough to make the legal exposure look like advertising. It remains one of the most profitable Italian horror imports of the decade and is widely cited as the title that opened the lane for the wave of Italian possession films that followed. 30 seconds. That is how long the film stops, dead, near its closing reel, to display a digital countdown clock and dare the audience to guess which of the suspects is the werewolf. The gimmick is called the werewolf break, and it is the only thing most casual viewers remember about The Beast Must Die, which is unfair to the rest of the picture, but understandable, because the rest of the picture is harder to talk about, and the gimmick is right there. Here is the part I want to underline, though, because it is the part that gets lost. The film around the gimmick is sharper than its drive-in marketing suggested. Amicus, the British horror studio that ran alongside Hammer for most of the late 1960s and early 1970s, gave director Paul Annett a cast that knew what to do with the material. Calvin Lockhart plays Tom Newcliffe, a wealthy big-game hunter who has invited a group of guests to his country estate because he believes one of them is a werewolf and intends to identify and kill the creature over the course of a weekend. Peter Cushing plays the anthropologist who knows the most about lycanthropy. Charles Gray holds the room as one of the more entertaining suspects. The film treats the central mystery as a closed-room puzzle, and the audience is given the same clues the characters get, which makes the werewolf break less of a stunt than a deliberate handoff from the screen to the viewer. The picture has aged into a cult favorite. It plays at horror festivals regularly, and the original cinema gimmick has been replicated by repertory houses that pause the film for the original 30 seconds, count the audience down, and watch them argue. Calvin Lockhart's lead performance, which gave the picture a black hero of unusual command for the genre at the time, has drawn renewed attention in recent critical writing on 1970s horror. "I want to scare the popcorn out of you," William Castle had said for most of his career, a producer's slogan that he turned into a brand of cinema-going experience over 30 years of theatrical gimmicks. Bug was the last picture Castle would produce, released in 1975 and directed by Janos Swark. And the slogan had to do quieter work this time, because the showmanship of the earlier Castle pictures could not survive the cinema economics of the mid-1970s. The premise is small-scale apocalyptic. An earthquake in rural California opens a fissure that releases a previously unknown species of cockroach with the ability to generate sparks by rubbing its abdominal segments together. The bugs catch fire to anything they crawl on. A local university scientist, played by Bradford Dillman, takes them home to study, breeds them with common cockroaches in an attempt to understand them, and produces a generation that is significantly worse than the original. Director Swark, who would shortly direct Jaws 2, keeps the picture grounded in domestic spaces, with most of the horror happening in kitchens, garages, and the small back rooms of an ordinary American house. The effects work is practical, with actual cockroaches handled extensively by the principal cast and by the special effects team, and the result is close-quarters insect horror that digital effects have never quite matched. Castle died less than 2 years after the picture's release. The film was his final feature credit, and it remains the closing entry in a producing career that had previously included House on Haunted Hill, The Tingler, and Rosemary's Baby. The mannequins blink. Not always, and not in a way the camera lets the audience confirm in any one moment, but enough of the time that the viewers of Tourist Trap are never entirely sure whether the mannequins lining the walls of the roadside museum are watching them, or whether the watching is part of what the protagonists are imagining about a place that already feels wrong. Director David Schmoller's 1979 debut feature is one of the harder pictures of the late decade to slot into a single horror category because the parts that look like slasher cinema sit next to parts that look like surrealist nightmare. The setup is familiar. 5 young people on a road trip break down near a tourist attraction that has been abandoned by the highway redirection, find the proprietor, played by Chuck Connors in a performance that mixes folksy welcome with something the audience is not supposed to settle on, and discover that the mannequins in the museum are not all mannequins. Some of them once were people. The film's central villain has the ability to move objects and human faces with his mind. The mannequins in the building animate around him. The picture stages its kills against backdrops of frozen artificial bodies, and the visual effect is closer to nightmare logic than to anything the slasher cycle was producing in the same year. The film opened modestly in 1979 to limited theatrical play, suffered from poor distribution, and was largely forgotten outside the home video circuit. Stephen King later named it among the scariest films he had seen, a citation that pulled it back into the conversation, and the picture has been steadily reclaimed since as one of the more genuinely unsettling American horror films of its year. Restorations from the late 2000s have introduced it to audiences who had previously known it only by reputation. The faces don't just melt, they liquefy in a continuous slow flow of latex and dyed wax that runs for what feels like an unbroken 7 or 8 minutes of screen time. And somewhere inside that flow, you can pick out Ernest Borgnine, William Shatner, and a very young John Travolta, all dissolving into the rain. The Devil's Rain is the closing image you keep, and the picture earned its place in the decade's horror highlight reel, mostly on the strength of that single sequence. Okay, full disclosure on my view of this one. The movie is gloriously, unrepentantly ridiculous. Director Robert Fuest, coming off the two Dr. Phibes pictures, treats the film as satanic spectacle from the first frame, with Borgnine in goat-horned makeup leading a desert cult that has waited 100 years for the return of a stolen book of damned souls. The cast is the kind of mid-1970s assembly that suggests the producers were promising something to everyone. Eddie Albert plays a parapsychologist, Tom Skerritt plays a worried brother, Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, was retained as a technical consultant, and the production publicized his involvement aggressively. None of the parts hang together with any particular logic, and that is not the point. The point is the imagery, and the imagery is unembarrassed, full-volume, paperback cover horror in a way the genre would not stage so openly again for years. The closing sequence runs to its end without cutting away. There is no kicker, no resolution, no final survivor monologue. The rain falls, the cult dissolves, and the camera holds for a length most studios would never have approved. The advertising leaned into that ending as its single selling point, building the entire campaign around the dissolution sequence with the promise that audiences had never seen anything like it. Most of them in 1975 had not. John Travolta, in only his second feature role, plays one of the cult members and spends his final scene melting. He would film Saturday Night Fever less than 2 years later. In late autumn 1970, on the off-season Belgian coastline at Ostend, director Harry Kummel filmed Daughters of Darkness inside a grand seaside hotel that the production had largely to itself. The empty corridors, the period furniture, and the cold North Sea light outside the windows would become the picture's signature, and the film's reputation rests on the use Kummel makes of those interiors as much as on anything that happens inside them. The story is a vampire reinvention. A young married couple, recently arrived at the hotel, encounter an elegant older woman traveling with her younger female companion. The older woman, played by Delphine Seyrig, lets her name slip in a way that suggests she has been letting it slip for centuries. She is, the film implies without quite stating, the historical Countess Elizabeth Bathory, still moving, still hunting, still patient. Seyrig plays her with a register most vampire films never reached, somewhere between salon hostess and predator. And the picture treats the eventual targeting of the young wife as a slow seduction rather than a chase. There are no fangs displayed on screen, no traditional vampire iconography on the surface, and most of the violence happens in registers the genre had not previously taken seriously. The picture is closer to Marguerite Duras than to Hammer. The film was acquired for a limited United States release by Gemini Films in 1971 and ran in art houses through the year, eventually crossing into a wider cult appreciation as one of the few European vampire pictures of the period reclaimed by both genre critics and writers on art cinema. Seyrig's performance is regularly cited as the standard against which subsequent stylized vampire portrayals are measured. I sit here, and I can't believe that it happened. And yet, I have to believe it. That is Jessica's voiceover at the opening of Let's Scare Jessica to Death, addressed partly to the audience and partly to herself, partly memory and partly diagnosis. The film opens with a woman who knows she has experienced something and cannot tell anyone, including the version of herself who has to keep narrating what it was. Like The Witch Who Came from the Sea, this is one of the 1970s horror films that pulls its threat from the perceptual edge rather than from anything the audience can clearly see. Jessica, recently released from a psychiatric institution, has moved with her husband and a friend to a farmhouse in rural Connecticut where they intend to live quietly. The farmhouse comes with a young woman already inside it who introduces herself as a drifter and stays. The town comes with stories about a previous owner who drowned in the lake more than 100 years earlier and was never found. The audience is invited throughout the picture to read every incident two ways, as supernatural intrusion or as the recurrence of Jessica's own instability. Director John D. Hancock holds both readings in suspension without ever forcing the picture to commit. What the film does that very few of its contemporaries managed is treat its protagonist's uncertain perception as the actual content of the horror rather than as a delaying tactic before a reveal. Zora Lampert plays Jessica with a quiet, drifting attentiveness that makes the audience trust her even as the picture withholds the means to verify what she sees. Lampert, primarily a stage actress with limited prior film work, was cast against the genre's standard female lead types, and the performance has gained the recognition it deserves only in retrospective writing on the picture. The shots of the lake, the long takes inside the farmhouse, and the sparse score by Orville Stuber give the film a New England summer texture that is more pastoral than gothic, which makes the unease harder to dismiss. The picture's final scenes do not resolve the question they have been asking. Jessica continues to narrate, the boat continues to drift, and the audience is left holding both possible readings without being told which one to keep. The town has the wrong light. The shoreline glows after sunset in a register that the cinematographer of Messiah of Evil will hold for entire scenes, with sodium orange spilling across boardwalk surfaces and rolling onto faces in ways that no realist coastal town would ever look. Filmmakers Willard Huyck and Gloria Katz, soon to co-write American Graffiti, made the picture in 1971 and 1972, with a partial release in 1973 and a tangled distribution history that obscured the film for most of its first decade. The setup is a young woman's search for her artist father in a small seaside community in California. She finds his diary first, then his empty studio, then a town in which the residents are not exactly what they appear to be. There is a curse, there is a 100-year-old promise, there is a strange figure in the desert who has been waiting. The plot, however, is not the picture's interest. The directors are more concerned with set pieces, particularly two extended sequences that have become canonical in the cult conversation around the film, one inside a supermarket and one inside a movie theater, both of which use empty consumer space to stage horror that has nothing to do with the slasher beat. The picture's color design and editing rhythm are closer to Alejandro Jodorowsky than to drive-in horror, and that displacement is part of what kept the film out of mainstream conversation for so long. The picture has been restored multiple times across the decades, and each restoration has revealed slightly different cuts. Whether any version represents what Huyck and Katz intended to release in 1973 remains a question their later interviews have raised without fully answering. This is a horror film shot in noon light, on a working farm, with two 10-year-old boys at the center who look identical to anyone outside the family and are. The other opens on a summer afternoon that postcards and memoirs have agreed to call American, with a stone well, a grandmother on the porch, a baseball, and a slow accumulation of incidents that begin to suggest one of the brothers is wrong in ways the other cannot quite name. The contradiction is intentional. Director Robert Mulligan, 2 years out from Summer of '42, wanted the picture to feel like a remembered childhood, with the dark line of something else running just under it. Niles and Holland Perry, twin boys, live with their mother, their grandmother, and a small extended family on the farm in 1935. A series of accidents begins to occur in the neighborhood. The grandmother has been teaching Niles a game she calls the Great Game, an imaginative empathy exercise in which Niles can inhabit the perception of other living things. The audience is shown the game working, or appearing to work. As the accidents grow more severe, the audience also begins to register that the family's responses to the incidents do not match the responses an outside observer might expect, and that the picture is asking the viewer to look more carefully at what it has already shown. The screenplay was written by Thomas Tryon from his own novel, and the film holds on to the novel's central trick longer than most adaptations have managed. What the film finally leaves open is not the question of what happened on the farm. That question is answered. The question the picture leaves open is the one about complicity, and which characters in the household knew and how long they had known and what they decided to do with that knowledge. The film stops without supplying those answers. Martin's my favorite, George A. Romero said many times across the decades following his 1977 picture, often when interviewers had come to ask him about Night of the Living Dead or Dawn of the Dead, and were surprised to find that the film he wanted to talk about was the small, regional, almost monochrome vampire story he had shot in Braddock, Pennsylvania, with a tiny crew, a non-professional lead, and a script that openly refused every existing rule the vampire film had accumulated since Nosferatu. The picture is built around an ambiguity it never resolves and never tries to. Martin, played by John Amplas in a performance the picture has never adequately credited him for, is a young man who arrives in a Pittsburgh suburb to live with an elderly cousin named Kuda, who believes Martin is a centuries-old vampire bound to the family by old country law. Martin himself believes nothing supernatural about his condition. He kills, drinks blood, requires injections to subdue his victims because he is not strong enough to overpower them by other means, and conducts his nighttime life out of necessity rather than enchantment. The flashbacks the film inserts could be memories or could be fantasies. Romero declines to clarify, and the picture's argument is that the distinction has stopped mattering by the time the story begins. Where the elegant European vampires of Daughters of Darkness relied on the audience accepting a supernatural premise, Martin removes that premise entirely and asks whether what remains is more or less disturbing. The picture was shot on a budget of roughly $80,000, with cinematography by Michael Gornick and a score by Donald Rubinstein that recurs in fragmented variations across the film. Tom Savini, in his first major collaboration with Romero, handled the makeup and the practical effects, with the violence staged at low budget and high specificity. The picture was almost unwatchable in its original cut due to print quality on first release, and its reputation was built largely by viewers who tracked it down on home video over the following decade. The film has since been restored, written about extensively, and reclaimed as one of the most original American vampire pictures of the 1970s, which is the position Romero himself had taken since the moment the picture was finished. Asked decades later, in interview after interview, which of his own films he would point a new viewer toward, he gave the same answer: "Martin's my favorite." In the summer of 1975, the production of Burnt Offerings moved into the Dunsmuir House in Oakland, California, a 50-room mansion built in the late 19th century by a coal and shipping fortune. The location would carry the picture. Director Dan Curtis, the producer behind Dark Shadows and The Night Stalker, intended the house itself to function as the antagonist, with the family inside playing reactive roles to a setting that grew stronger as they grew weaker. The plot follows a couple, their son and an aging aunt, who take a summer rental on a country estate at a price that should have alerted them sooner than it does. The owners, played by Eileen Heckart and Burgess Meredith in two of the picture's strangest small turns, leave specific instructions. Feed the elderly mother in the upstairs room 3 times a day. Don't bother her. Stay the summer. The house begins to repair itself as the residents weaken. Cracked tiles smooth over, peeling wallpaper rehangs itself, dying plants come back. Karen Black and Oliver Reed, as the couple, give performances calibrated to the film's slow erosion, with Bette Davis as the aunt providing the picture's first major casualty. Curtis stages the haunting as a kind of consumption, with the house drawing vitality through the people inside it, the way a parasite draws nutrients from a host. The film was released by United Artists in October 1976 to mixed reviews and modest business, and its reputation grew steadily in the decades that followed. Writers on haunted house cinema have come to treat Burnt Offerings as the precursor to The Shining in tone, if not in plot, and the picture is now widely cited as one of the strongest American haunted house films of the decade. On the Upper East Side of Manhattan in 1976, the production of The Sentinel moved into a Brooklyn Heights brownstone that director Michael Winner had selected for the curb appeal that masks something behind the door, and the picture proceeded to spend its running time peeling that door back. The film closes our list because it is the entry that moves horror most decisively into the city, away from rural houses and isolated estates, and into the apartment building, where the neighbor across the hall is the supernatural problem. The story follows Allison Parker, a young fashion model played by Christina Rains, who rents an apartment in a brownstone she cannot quite afford and finds it occupied by neighbors who are not what they appear to be. The blind priest on the top floor, played by John Carradine, never moves from his window. The neighbors below begin appearing in her rooms at hours she had not invited them. The building, the picture eventually reveals, exists at a Catholic theological boundary between the world and what lies below it, and the priest is its sentinel. Winner brought in an extraordinary supporting cast for what amount to small roles, with Burgess Meredith, Sylvia Miles, Beverly D'Angelo, Christopher Walken, Eli Wallach, Jerry Orbach, and Jeff Goldblum all appearing in early or supporting parts. The picture has been criticized, on release and since, for casting choices in its closing sequence that draw on the appearances of real performers in ways more contemporary productions would not have permitted, and that criticism has shaped subsequent discussion of the film. The film opened in February 1977 to commercial success and divided critical reception, and its reputation has remained contested. The picture's defenders treat it as one of the cleanest urban religious horror films of the decade, with its apartment building haunting prefiguring later New York horror cinema. Its detractors point to the closing sequence as a problem the film cannot overcome. Both readings have stayed in circulation, and the picture continues to be screened, written about, and argued over. This is what slipped through the cracks. Satanic road movies, killer furniture, political werewolves, foster mothers with second sight, stolen souls, swamps that fought back, occult ceremonies played at full operatic volume, vampires who refused to stay glamorous, and houses that grew younger by feeding on the families inside them. The 1970s didn't produce too little great horror. It produced too much strange, risky, and unclassifiable material for the mainstream canon to carry, which is why so many of these films had to wait for cult audiences, restoration labels, or late-night rediscovery to catch up with them. Rediscovering these 27 means rediscovering the full size of the decade, rougher than the canon remembers, weirder than the prestige titles allow, and stitched together by filmmakers willing to look ridiculous in service of something genuinely disturbing. If this kind of unpacking is the work you want more of, hitting like and subscribing keeps the deep cuts coming, and the comments are where the next list takes shape. So, drop the forgotten 70s horror title you think we owe a chapter to next.